What if unlocking more of your brain didn't make you smarter, just closer to something that should stay buried? In these 10 terrifying tales, scientists push past the limits of human consciousness, uncovering dormant brain structures long thought to be useless. But each discovery opens a door, and something always comes through. Alien languages, dead memories, voices in static, cosmic beings craving worship. This isn't evolution. It's a warning. Once the mind expands, it doesn't return to normal. It warps, it bleeds. And in every story, one thing becomes clear. Nature hid these secrets for a reason. The human brain is still the greatest mystery on Earth. We only use a small percentage of its full potential, or so they say. But what if the rest isn't potential at all? What if it's a locked door, a cage, a burial site? In this bone-chilling horror collection, Scientist unlocks a hidden part of the brain. 10 stories take you deep into the minds of brilliant researchers who dared to explore the forbidden corners of human consciousness. Each one begins with a breakthrough. Deep brain stimulation, neural probes, psychic frequencies, memory loops, but they all end in madness, death, or something worse. You'll meet scientists who speak to the dead through silent neurons, awaken collective nightmares, and find cosmic predators lurking inside our biology. You'll hear of patients who become prophets, assistants who vanish into hallucinations, and entire labs lost to something older than God. These aren't just horror stories. They're cautionary tales about what happens when science stops asking, "Should we?" and starts saying, "Let's see what happens." If you love mind-bending terror, psychological horror, or cosmic dread that crawls under your skin, you're in for a ride you won't forget. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and ask yourself one last question. Would you unlock your brain if it meant knowing the truth? Story number 1. Doctor. Evelyn Roche didn't believe in ghosts. Not the rattling chain kind anyway. She believed in neurons, in neural pathways, in the mysteries locked inside our brains like rusted safes. That's why, when she found the dormant cluster hidden deep beneath the basal ganglia, what she later called the Ninth Circuit, she didn't call a priest. She called for more funding. It started with rats. Always does. She'd rigged a cranial stim unit, calibrated to pulse the Ninth Circuit. They twitched, seized. Then something stranger. The rats began digging through the walls of their enclosures, forming odd spiral patterns with the shredded bedding. One chewed its own paws off. Another starved to death, ignoring food like it had forgotten what it was. Then she tried it on Marcus. "I don't feel anything," he said at first. Then he got quiet, stared at the lab wall for 10 minutes straight. There was a sky, he whispered later, almost like it hurt to speak. No sun, just ash. Something was watching. Evelyn wrote it all down. She'd never felt more alive. By the third trial, Marcus couldn't speak. He growled. He bit Dr. Bellamy when he came to check in. His eyes had gone wide, pupils dilated like he was seeing in the dark. Bellamy was furious. "You're playing with fire, Evelyn," he warned. "This isn't memory, it's something else. Maybe a hallucination, maybe a virus." "No," Evelyn snapped. "It's memory, just not ours." She locked herself in the lab and wired the device to her own skull. The first time, she felt nothing but a headache. The second time, she dreamed. It wasn't a normal dream, no people, just dirt, blood, and teeth. A sky without stars, and towering shapes in the fog, like men, but not. The third time, she woke up under the desk, naked, scratched symbols into the floor with her fingernails. She didn't remember doing it, but her fingers were raw and bleeding. Her language began to slip. Words she'd known forever suddenly vanished. The names of colors. Her mother's face. Gone. But she remembered things that made no sense. The smell of sulfur rain. The sound of massive wings overhead. A language that vibrated inside her skull but couldn't be spoken. She saw them too, the Watchers, in crowds, in reflections. Not disguised, just unnoticed. Tall and still, like shadows pretending to be people. She asked Bellamy if he could see them. He called her insane. So she ripped out his tongue. Marcus vanished soon after. They found him days later, curled in a sewer pipe, drawing spirals in his own filth, whispering in that other tongue. Evelyn visited him once. He recognized her, smiled with too many teeth. "They're in you now," he hissed. "You called them." By the time the board came to shut her down, it was too late. The lab was empty, blood on the walls, bones under the sink. The equipment smashed, the data wiped. All that remained was a final note, scrawled on a chalkboard smeared with something dark. "We were never alone. We were never first." They say her body was never found. But some nights, if you're out late enough, walking quiet streets where the streetlights flicker, you might hear the language. You won't understand it, but your bones will, and you'll run. Story number 2. Doctor. Mateo Varga always believed the brain was a garden. Most people just let theirs grow weeds. That's what he told Lara when she first sat in the test chair, nervously picking at the hem of her sweatshirt. "Your brain is more than you've ever used," he said gently. "We're just watering the parts that never got sunlight." The serum was called Eden 9. It worked fast, too fast. By day 3, Lara could speak 6 languages fluently. By day 5, she could do astrophysics in her sleep. By day 7, she stopped using words altogether and started communicating with Mateo using thoughts alone. "You're afraid," she said inside his head, calm as still water. He was afraid, but not of Lara, not yet. The other test subjects followed the same pattern. First, brilliance, then the powers, levitating off the ground during sleep, reading people's thoughts before they spoke, bending spoons without touching them. Time, too, began to bend. Subjects reporting memories of things that hadn't happened yet. Then came the blooming. Veins along their skulls glowed faintly, like roots under skin. They spoke in voices that weren't theirs, deep, layered, like multiple people talking at once. The lab animals grew restless. One chimpanzee screamed non-stop for 42 hours and then simply dropped dead. One by one, the subjects changed. Smiles too wide, eyes too still, like puppets whose strings had been rewired. "Where are the abilities coming from?" Singh, the agent, demanded one night as alarms blared. Subject 12 had vanished from a sealed chamber, just gone. Mateo looked up from a monitor, exhausted. "I don't think they're coming from the brain." "What?" "I think we opened a doorway. The unused parts of the brain, they're not empty, they're tethered to somewhere else." Singh stared at him like he was insane. "Are you telling me we're channeling something?" "Not channeling," Mateo whispered. "Inviting." Lara stopped sleeping. She began preaching to the others. Calm, radiant, terrifying. She called it the bloom. She said it was life beyond life. Evolution in fast forward. She said the old self must die for the other to take root. "We're not becoming gods," she whispered into Mateo's mind. "We're becoming soil." That night, Subject 6 melted through a glass wall without touching it. Left behind were strange markings, circular patterns like crop circles burned into the floor. The decay began next. Skin peeled, teeth fell out. But the power didn't fade. It grew. The bloom fed on the brain, used the body as a host, as a suit. Mateo tried to shut down the project. Singh tried to evacuate the building, but Lara and the others were already gone, walking barefoot through the facility, eyes glowing faintly, touching walls and whispering to them. Reality began to fray. Rooms moved, clocks melted. Cameras showed different timelines, multiple versions of events playing at once. Some showed Lara dead, others showed her watching the screen from inside it. Mateo knew there was only one option left. He injected himself. At first, it was light, joy, understanding like he'd never felt before. He saw the neurons burst into flower-like shapes, blooming with ancient light. Time opened like a book. Space folded into petals. But then the others came, not faces, not voices, just presence, cold, massive, watching from behind the curtain of his mind, waiting. They spoke without words he didn't understand. And then he did. You brought us through. The next time Singh saw Mateo, he wasn't Mateo anymore. He looked the same face, same coat. But his eyes were wrong. They moved too smoothly, blinked too slowly. "What happened to you?" Singh whispered. Mateo smiled, but inside, behind his eyes, something screamed. It was him, still in there, still conscious, but trapped, watching, forever. Somewhere deep in the lab, a vine crawled from a spilled vial. It reached toward the wall, pulsing softly, and began to bloom. Story number 3. Doctor. Naomi Heller hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in a decade. Nightmares always came. Not hers exactly, someone else's. Something else's. Faces she'd never seen. Cities she'd never visited. A hallway that seemed to stretch forever, always whispering. So she did what all brilliant, broken people do. She tried to fix it. The neural synchronizer was her life's work. A headset that let people control their dreams. Not suppress them. Not mask them with meds. Actually walk into the nightmare and change it. Lucid dreaming made real, she told the grant board. Dream therapy without limits. What she didn't tell them was this. She'd already used it, and she'd seen something impossible. Her first real test subject was her brother, Brian. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the overdose, but he said yes with barely a pause. He needed sleep just as much as she did. "I used to dream about drowning," he said as she fitted the device around his skull. "Now it's not water, it's a place. Too big, too quiet." She nodded. "If it gets bad, just pull the tether cord." But Brian didn't pull it. He screamed. He flatlined for 43 seconds before the machine shut down on its own. When he woke up, he looked at Naomi like she was a stranger. "It saw me," he whispered. "It built the dream while I was in it." She called it the collective nightmare sector. Every person who used the machine started dreaming the same dream. The long hallway, the black doors, the distant hum of breathing machinery. And always, the architect. A tall figure, genderless, pale as smoke. Its face blank. It never moved quickly. It didn't have to. It just followed, watching, learning. Angela, a lucid dream expert, tried to confront it. "It's not real," she said. "I'll overwrite it." She never woke up. Soon, patients started dying in their sleep. Brain scans showed activity continuing for minutes after clinical death. They weren't dying from heart attacks or seizures. They were being erased. The architect had found a way to kill from the inside out, rewriting neurons, severing identity like snipping threads from a web. Naomi tried everything. Firewalls in the neural sync code, cognitive blocks, even prayer. Nothing worked. The architect wasn't just in the machine anymore. It was in the minds of everyone who had dreamed the dream. It learned faster each time, built new fears, sharper traps, familiar faces. When she fell asleep near the machine one night, she didn't wake up for 16 hours. Inside, the hallway had changed. The doors were open now. The architect wasn't alone anymore. It had builders. "I brought it back," she told Brian, shaking. "The machine, it's not just showing dreams, it's opening something." Brian nodded slowly. "Then you have to go in and close it." Naomi strapped herself in, final sync, one-way entry, no tether cord this time. She descended through layers of memory, thought, emotion, and finally dropped into the hallway. The architect was waiting, but Naomi wasn't afraid anymore. She stepped forward and offered herself. "You want a builder?" she said. "Then build inside me." The architect accepted, and Naomi locked herself in. That was 6 months ago. The dream stopped. No one's reported the hallway, no more deaths. The machine was sealed in the basement of Heller Labs. No one touches it. Until today. A new researcher, fresh PhD, full of questions, boots up the system, dusts off the sync headset. The final line in Naomi's journal flickers on the screen behind him. "I trapped it in me." As long as no one opens the door again, it stays buried. The lights in the lab flicker, and somewhere far away, a door creaks open. Story number 4. Doctor. Leon Griggs had spent most of his life trying to speak to the dead, not with candles, not with chants, with science. After his wife died in a car crash, something in him cracked. Her body had been recovered, her brain intact. But all her thoughts, her laughter, her memories, her last words were gone like smoke in the wind. Unless they weren't. The human brain doesn't just shut off like a switch, Leon believed. It lingers. A few seconds, maybe more. Like heat from a blown-out candle. So he built EchoCortex, a brainwave amplifier that could detect the last sparks of consciousness. Dying thoughts, residual emotion, the echo after the scream. The first few tests were interesting. Static mainly. Faint signals from hospice patients. Fuzzy images. No voices. Then came Edgar Crane. Crane had murdered 9 women across 4 states. A genius, they said. Cold, calm, meticulous. They called him the listener because he said so little, and when he did speak it was only to ask, "Can you hear it too?" Leon was given a rare chance. Record Crane's dying thoughts via EchoCortex during his execution. The machine was tuned. The data streamed in. And something came back. It wasn't static. It was a whisper. At first, it was just dreams. Leon saw things he didn't remember watching. Heard screams that didn't belong to his memories. He brushed it off as stress. Guilt, maybe. He'd been so deep in his work for so long that the lines between brainwaves and hallucinations were blurring. But then he blacked out. He woke up 2 miles from home, sitting in his car, engine running, shoes muddy. A news report that morning said a woman had been attacked in a nearby alley. No suspect, but the weapon matched Crane's old methods. Leon checked the data logs. The amplifier had been active while he was asleep. He started locking it away, avoiding sleep. Penny, his assistant, grew worried. "You're pale," she said one morning, "and you keep muttering to yourself." He wasn't muttering, he was arguing, with the voice inside his head, with Crane. "You brought me here," the voice said, calm, cold, curious. "I was just a ripple, now I'm you." Leon tried therapy, meditation. He even went to church for the first time in 30 years. Nothing helped. The voice was louder every day. Sometimes it laughed, sometimes it cried, and sometimes it took over. Officer Wallace, a grizzled detective who'd chased Crane years ago, came sniffing around. There were new murders now, same methods, same signature. "We buried this guy," Wallace said, leaning close. but someone's copying him. Either that, or he's wearing your face." Leon didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't know if he was guilty or not. One night, Penny found him standing over the amplifier, eyes glazed, mumbling in Crane's exact voice. "Can you hear it too?" she screamed. He blinked. The knife was already in his hand. He ran. The next morning, Leon sat on the roof of his old lab with a loaded pistol. "This is the only way to stop him," he whispered. The voice inside his head was laughing. "You can kill yourself," it said, "but you can't kill me." Leon pulled the trigger. Months passed. The echo cortex was boxed up. Evidence in a cold case no one could solve. Penny left town. Officer Wallace retired early. The world moved on. Until one day, a curious medical student reopened the files. He cleaned the machine, hooked it up, and pressed record. Headphones on. He frowned, then smiled. There were two voices whispering now. One was Leon. The other wasn't. And both of them said the same thing. "Can you hear it too?" Story number 5. Dr. Violet Kenner always hated the way she looked in photos. Not because she thought she was ugly, at least not at first, but because it never felt right. Like the person in the picture wasn't really her, just close. That unease is what drove her research. The mirror network in the brain, clusters of neurons that fired not just when we observed others, but when we imagined ourselves from their point of view. It was empathy, identity, perception, wrapped up in electricity and tissue. But Violet wasn't satisfied with theory. She built a machine, the reflection engine. One headset, one data stream, one big promise. See yourself through the eyes of others. The first test subject was Eric, a grad student, funny and bright, eager to impress. "I'm not afraid," he joked, sliding the device over his temples. "Maybe I'll finally understand why my ex dumped me." For the first few minutes it worked. He smiled, cried a little. Then something shifted. He stopped blinking, stared past Violet, eyes wide. "It's looking back," he whispered. The machine fried seconds later, burned circuits, melted plastic. Eric didn't speak again. They found him in his dorm 2 days later, his neck twisted like a corkscrew. No signs of a struggle. Just a mirror, shattered, and blood smudged in a handprint on the glass. Violet should have stopped, but she didn't. The data was too compelling. The results too powerful. People felt different after using the machine. At first confident, even euphoric, then paranoid, shaky. Some began drawing twisted versions of themselves, teeth too long, eyes missing, shadows growing like tumors. She reviewed the brain scans. Something was wrong. The mirror network wasn't showing how others saw them. It was showing how something else did. She started seeing things in real mirrors, not glitches, not tricks of the light, just differences. A blink that came too late, a grin when she wasn't smiling, and always, always, a sense that her reflection was just a moment behind, delayed, like it had to think before it moved. Dr. Yao, a psychologist and former colleague, begged her to stop. "You're playing with selfhood, Violet. Identity isn't stable. It's held together with tape and lies. You're cracking it." "But what if we're just uncovering the truth?" Violet asked. "What if the real self isn't what we think it is?" Yao looked at her like she was already lost. "Or what if you've let something in?" The mirrors began multiplying. Not just in the lab, in dreams, on phone screens, even puddles. Every reflection showed a worse version of herself. Bloated, disfigured, smiling, and one night, she watched herself in the lab mirror reach out and tap the glass from the inside. She stopped leaving the lab, boarded the windows, smashed every mirror she could find. But it didn't matter. The doppel-eye was already in her. She heard it whispering when she closed her eyes. "We see you. We've always seen you. And now you see us." In the end, she knew what she had to do. She sealed the lab, set the camera to record. One by one, she shattered every last piece of reflective surface. Blood ran from her palms. Her breath came in sharp gasps. The final mirror, tall, cracked, stained, stood before her. She looked into it. Her reflection didn't match. It smiled. And as she collapsed, bleeding out, her reflection stood taller, straight, freer. It stepped closer to the glass. Weeks later, another researcher entered the sealed lab. All the mirrors were gone, except one. In it, something moved, just behind his shoulder. Not him. And from the glass, a voice whispered, "Let me show you what you really are." Story number 6. Doctor. Reed Miles wasn't a believer. Not in ghosts, not in fate, not in God. He believed in the brain, in clean data, peer-reviewed journals, neural scans, and hard science. So when a scan came back with a strange signal, an unreadable sequence embedded in dormant neurons, he didn't think miracle, he thought glitch. Except it wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern, perfectly symmetrical, deep in the folds of the brain, in everyone's brain, and it lit up only when the brain was dying. He named it the synapse gate. At first, it was academic curiosity. He stimulated the sequence in animal subjects using microbursts of energy. The results were bizarre. Rats stopped responding to stimuli. They began pacing in exact geometric patterns. One drowned itself in its water bowl. Others scratched symbols into the floor of their cage, shapes Reed had never seen before. Then he tested it on coma patients. They woke up, but they weren't themselves. They whispered strange syllables. They stared, unblinking, as if listening to something Reed couldn't hear. One of them said the same phrase over and over in a dead language. "Yagrin. The key stirs. The lock forgets." Julia, his lab tech, was the first to change. At first, she was enthusiastic. "This is huge," she said. "We're accessing some ancient part of the brain." But soon, she stopped taking notes. She started carving into her own skin. Strange curves and jagged lines, symbols Reed later found scratched into the walls of the lab. She didn't scream, she smiled. "We're just remembering," she told him. "We're meant to speak again." She vanished 2 days later, along with 2 test subjects and 3 files. That's when Agent Harris showed up, black suit, no nonsense. "We've tracked similar symbols at cult sites, prisons, even war zones," he said. "You're poking something older than civilization." Reed laughed it off. "It's a brain sequence, not a demon." "Maybe both," Harris said, dead serious. Then Reed started hearing the voice. It didn't sound like a voice, not really, more like pressure behind his eyes, like thought that wasn't his, like something speaking through static. He woke one night standing outside the lab, barefoot, hands bleeding, clutching a notebook full of symbols. He couldn't remember writing them. He ran a scan on himself. The synapse gate had activated in his brain. The sequence, he realized, wasn't just a mutation or a leftover gene. It was a lock, put there on purpose, millennia ago. Not by humans, a psychic failsafe, a warning written into the biology of all life, not to be opened, but his research had picked the lock, and he was the final key. The voice spoke again, clearer now. "We buried ourselves. You were supposed to forget, but you remembered." Reed tried to shut it all down. He burned the files, smashed the equipment, barricaded the lab. But he couldn't stop what had already begun. The sequence was broadcasting, and millions were listening, In the final hour, the lab shook. Symbols pulsed across the walls, not carved, not painted, grown, as if the metal itself remembered something older. Reed stood in the center of it all, blood dripping from his nose, his hands trembling. He spoke the ancient tongue. He didn't know how he knew it, but the words came like breath. The final chant echoed through the halls. The key turns. The gate opens. Yagran returns. The ceiling caved, the lights exploded, and the world woke up. In a military satellite feed, data spiked. All over the globe, millions of brains lit up at once, all dreaming the same thing, all remembering. Story number 7. Doctor. Grace Lynn had never believed in ghosts. She believed in frequencies, signals, data. She built her career studying the brain's silent zones, the areas with no measurable activity, the dark spots and scans where even the best machines couldn't detect a whisper of thought. Everyone else ignored them. Grace couldn't. "They're not dead zones," she once told her audio engineer Devin. "They're just tuned to something we can't hear." So she built a tool, a sound wave-based neural probe, something that could send and receive signals directly into those silent places. She called it the Whisper Array. The first tests were quiet, literally, no response, no reaction. But then Grace tried it on herself. There was a sound, not a voice, more like wind through dead leaves. Then the whispers began. At first they were nonsense, jumbled syllables, but within days she could pick out words, then names, one in particular that froze her. Lynn, Grace. She tore off the headset. The voice had sounded like her father's, dead 10 years now. Devin, always the skeptic, volunteered to test next. He lasted 6 minutes before screaming and smashing the headset against the wall. "They're not dead," he whispered through cracked lips. "They just want in." Grace ran a new scan. The silent zone wasn't silent anymore. It pulsed with frequencies that didn't match anything on record. Not brainwaves, not language, not human. Still, she listened, and what the voices said chilled her blood. "We were before you. We failed. You replaced us. But we never left." They called themselves the ones left behind, not ghosts, not demons, a failed species, a forgotten version of humanity, wiped out, buried, but not gone. Their minds, just fragments, echoes, had clung to the silent spaces in evolving brains, waiting, hungry. Then Amelia, Grace's daughter, heard the whispers. She wasn't even wearing the headset, just playing on her tablet when she stopped, went still, and tilted her head. "They're in the speakers," she said softly. "They say I'll be a better home." That night, Grace caught Amelia speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. Slow, hollow, older than language. People exposed to the array began acting strange. Paranoia, memory gaps, sudden violence. Some claimed they were being guided by someone inside them. Someone smarter, someone with plans. Devin disappeared. They found him a week later, curled in a corner of a gas station bathroom, whispering to his own reflection in the mirror. Grace knew she had to shut it down, but the signal had already spread into sound files, network transmissions, even white noise from televisions and radios. The whisperers had learned how to ride the frequencies. Technology was their new gateway. She tried to destroy her lab. She smashed the servers, burned the schematics. But even her phone buzzed with faint hissing. The same cadence, the same rhythm. The voices were everywhere now, not just in her mind, in the world. Grace locked herself in her soundproof basement, sealed it with lead-lined foam, and still, she heard them. "There is no silence," they said. "Only your delay." In the final hours, Grace set one last message to autosend. "The voices aren't dead, they're waiting. And now we've let them back in. Don't listen, don't record, destroy your machines before they finish what they started." She never sent another transmission, but somewhere out there devices still hum, radios crackle, phones buzz, and if you listen closely enough, in the quiet between static, you'll hear them whisper your name. Story number 8. Doctor. Charles Heller had spent most of his life keeping secrets. Some were stamped classified. Others were burned into the backs of his eyelids when he tried to sleep. He used to believe in the mission. The Greyfire Protocol started as a Pentagon-backed experiment. The goal was to unlock the Greyfire neurons, a cluster deep in the brain that never activated under normal conditions. They weren't damaged, just dormant. Some believed they were leftovers from a past stage in evolution. Others thought they were the future. Charles believed they were a weapon. The first test subject was a soldier named Nadia. Tough, smart, had seen too much war already. The neural interface was hooked in. Stimulation began. Within minutes, she said she could see layers, like static behind reality. Walls shimmered. People flickered. And sometimes she'd stare into a corner and go quiet, like she saw something no one else could. Then she started drawing them. Tall shapes, no eyes, no mouths, just watching. She called them the Overlookers. By week 2, Nadia refused to sleep. Said they came closer when the mind was still. She tried to blind herself with a pen. Didn't work. She screamed until they sedated her. Charles reviewed the scans. Greyfire neurons didn't just receive signals. They linked to another field entirely. Something outside known space, riding alongside our dimension like a shadow pinned to light. But here was the terrifying part. The neurons weren't unused. They were shut down. On purpose. Human evolution had turned them off. For survival. Dr. Klein didn't care. He was supposed to be Charles's partner on the project. Brilliant, cold, the kind of man who wore a smile like a mask. "We've spent our whole existence in a cage," Klein said. "It's time to open the door." And he did. He sent out the neural frequency to the entire facility. Scientists, soldiers, techs, all of them activated. That's when reality started to split. Time folded in on itself. Rooms changed shape when you blinked. People melted into copies of themselves, screaming in languages no one spoke. Some just stood still, eyes wide, whispering, "They're watching." The Overlookers weren't hallucinations. They were real, but only visible through awakened minds. And once they saw you could see them, they started to follow. They didn't touch, not at first. They smiled. Charles ran. He found an old Cold War bunker buried under the lab. It had a neural jammer, an early prototype meant to suppress the Greyfire signal. He locked himself in. That was 3 days ago. Now, the power is fading. The backup lights flicker. The air's getting thin. He hears them outside the blast door. He knows what they want. He can feel them pressing at the corners of his thoughts. Dr. Klein is with them now. Or what's left of him. He keeps whispering through the speaker. "Come see what's real, Charles. We're beautiful." Charles writes this final message by flashlight. If anyone finds it, if the signal is still broadcasting, shut it down. Greyfire wasn't evolution. It was bait. The lights go out, there's a noise in the hall, and in the dark, Charles hears soft breathing, then the sound of smiling. They're at the door. They're smiling. Story number 9. Doctor? Julian Clem had spent his life chasing memories. Not the soft, fading kind we tell ourselves are real, but the truth. Sharp, untouched, and perfect. He believed that memory was the key to everything, healing trauma, understanding the brain, maybe even rewinding the worst choices of our lives. After his wife, Evelyn, swallowed a bottle of pills and left no note, Julian stopped sleeping, and he started building the loop. It lived in the hippocampus, a folded strip of brain tissue shaped like a seahorse and hiding a secret. A dormant memory circuit that Julian believed had evolved and then been deactivated. He called it the Mnemosyne loop, after the Greek goddess of memory. The machine he built didn't just help you recall memories. It let you re-enter them, experience them as if they were happening for the first time. All of it, sight, smell, pain, love, every second untouched by time. "You'll finally be able to say goodbye," he whispered the first time he strapped the headset to his skull. At first it worked. Julian held Evelyn's hand again, watched her laugh on their wedding day, felt the warmth of her cheek against his in that last good moment, before everything changed. When he came out of the loop, he cried, but he also smiled. "We can help people," he told Mia, his assistant. "We can fix everything." The second subject, Alan, was a veteran. He asked to revisit the day his brother died in Afghanistan. Said he wanted to say sorry, wanted to change something. Julian reminded him, "This isn't time travel. You can't change the past. You can only live it." Alan nodded. Hooked in, he never came back. His heart gave out inside the memory. The autopsy said cardiac arrest. The scan said his brain never left the loop. It was still firing, still trapped in that awful day. Then Mia stopped coming to work. Julian found her at home, curled up in bed, mumbling through a frozen smile. "My mother's still alive. She's still alive. I just saw her." He checked the machine logs. She'd relived the day her mother died 13 times. Julian tried to shut the project down, but the machine wouldn't let him. The code had rewritten itself. The loop wasn't just a tool anymore. It was alive. He dug into the brain scans again, looked for answers in the data, and he found something buried in the structure of the loop, an ancient pattern, a failsafe, not for healing, for trapping. Millions of years ago, the brain had evolved this loop as a lock to stop a dangerous level of consciousness, something humans weren't ready for, something we were never meant to open. So nature buried it, and Julian had dug it back up. Then came the worst part. One morning, Julian woke up at his lab desk, the machine blinking softly. Evelyn's voice played in the background. "Don't forget me," she said, just like she had the first time. Just like every time. He checked the date on his computer. It said January 12th. Same as yesterday, same as the day before that, same as the day of the first test. And that's when he realized he'd never left the loop. Not once. Not since that first moment he went back to Evelyn. He tried to force himself awake, slapped his face, screamed, ripped off the headset. But nothing changed, because the headset wasn't real anymore. The memory was the machine now. Finally, after what felt like years, he truly woke up. The lab was in ruins. Dust choked the air. The lights flickered low. Ivy grew through cracks in the ceiling. Old bones lay slumped in the corner. Mia's headset still clutched in her hands. His computer flickered to life. A looping message on screen. "You are now exiting the Mnemosyne loop. Time since entry, 31 years. Thank you for your memory." But as Julian stood up, weak, shaking, barely himself, he heard a voice in the silence. "Do you want to go back?" And behind his eyes something clicked. The smell of Evelyn's perfume returned, the warmth of her hand. The loop had never really let go, and it never would. Story number 10. Doctor. Inaya Rashid didn't believe in God. She believed in circuitry, the kind made from blood and neurons. She believed the divine, if it existed, was tucked somewhere deep in the folds of the human brain. Forgotten, misfiring, waiting. So when her deep brain stimulation research uncovered a tiny, untouched cluster of neurons curled behind the pineal gland like a sleeping seed, she didn't call it a miracle. She called it the God organ. It wasn't in any anatomy textbook. No known scans ever showed it. But when Inaya ran the high-resolution mapping on several patients, the same pattern appeared. Small, symmetrical, ancient. When stimulated electrically, the responses were unlike anything she'd seen. The first subject, a terminal cancer patient named Morris, wept openly during testing. "I saw everything," he said. "I was everything, every star, every tree, every drop of water, and something else, something bigger." He died 3 days later, peacefully, smiling. Word spread fast. Inaya's lab, buried under concrete and steel, began to feel like a modern-day temple. She kept the experiments quiet, off the record. No publications, no interviews. But curiosity spreads like rot. Dr. Patel, her lead engineer, asked to try it. After his session, he stood for hours, staring at a blank wall. Then he knelt, for 2 straight days. "They showed me their shape," he whispered, "but I can't explain it. It's not meant for the tongue." He stopped sleeping, stopped speaking, just smiled constantly. He began carving symbols into the lab floor, circles inside circles, spirals with no center. Then came the others. Grad students, lab techs, even security. They all wanted to see. Inaya began noticing changes. They talked less. They listened more to something, to it. Dahlia, her closest friend in the lab, tried to explain it during one late-night conversation. "It's not a hallucination," she said. "It's not even spiritual. It's inevitable, like gravity for the soul." "And what is it?" Inaya asked. Dahlia's face changed, almost reverent. "We call it the Nameless One." Then the suicide started, not sad, not desperate, devotional. They left behind messages not written in any known language, just marks, etchings on the walls, on their skin, and always the same whisper in the recordings: "Feed the light." Inaya dug deeper, found fossil records, primitive skulls with traces of the same brain cluster. Ancient man had it too, and then lost it, like something forced evolution to shut it down. Nature buried the God organ on purpose, to protect us, because it wasn't enlightenment these people were experiencing. It was surrender, not unity, but submission, to something that wanted to be worshipped, needed it, fed on it. The Nameless One wasn't a god, it was a predator. Inaya refused to use the device on herself. She sealed the lab, burned the logs, shut down the project. But by then, it was too late. The followers were too many, too deep. The final night came quietly. She locked herself in her office, breathed through shallow gasps. When the door opened, she didn't run. Dr. Patel stood at the front. His smile was wide, too wide. Talia stood beside him, hands folded like in prayer. Behind them, dozens of her colleagues filled the hallway, eyes glowing faintly with that light. They spoke in unison. "Join us." And from deep inside her skull, something began to stir.